Good afternoon. On behalf of Shatterproof, welcome to our virtual briefing and launch of the Shatterproof Addiction Stigma Index. My name is Dr. Suzette Glasner. I am a clinical psychologist and associate professor of psychiatry at UCLA. I am also host of the Dr. Suzette Glasner podcast. I am an author, and my most recent book released is entitled Addiction: What Everyone Needs to Know. I am delighted to moderate this discussion today, which is International Recovery Day, so it couldn't be more fitting for this particular conversation. Before we kick off, please note that today's briefing will be recorded, and should you have any questions, we ask that you include those in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We will address questions at the end of the briefing. For those of you who are just learning about Shatterproof, I have a particular fondness for this organization. Shatterproof is a national nonprofit dedicated to transforming the addiction treatment system in the United States. Shatterproof is focused on guiding society, especially families, through the complexities of a substance use disorder, informing the public on prevention, treatment, and recovery from addiction, and educating the public to reduce addiction stigma to ensure that people who use substances or have a substance use disorder can live healthy and fulfilled lives. And I will say, as a practicing clinical psychologist who has been treating addiction and substance use disorders for a couple of decades, I have seen some transformations that have been just so rewarding among so many people who receive evidence-based therapies, of which we have so many available and are underutilized. Thanks to Shatterproof and all of their efforts, we're seeing that shift. The genesis of Shatterproof was the outcome of CEO and founder Gary Mendel's quest to make sense of the unfathomable after the loss of his son, Brian. I also had the great privilege of interviewing Gary Mendel on the Dr. Suzette Glasner podcast and became even more deeply familiar with his story and the way that he's transformed the pain of his personal loss into great outcomes and social support and a way forward for so many people and families. Gary and his team are working to change the public's attitudes and understanding of addiction as a treatable chronic illness. And that's something that scientists such as myself, who've been focused on addiction, have been working really hard to achieve. And it's partnerships with people like Gary and organizations like Shatterproof that can really synergize what we know in science to make it more of a reality. And to advance really public understanding. One of the organization's key initiatives is the Shatterproof National Stigma Initiative. That's a multi-sectorial movement designed to address the stigma experienced by people who use substances or who have substance use disorders. This is also an initiative that I have a great passion for myself as someone who has been conducting research on stigma, particularly as it relates to opioid use disorder and the use of medications to treat opioid use disorder, which are somewhat underutilized and largely as a result of stigmatized views or misunderstanding about how these medications work. The initiative works closely with state agencies, community organizations, and individuals to overcome addiction stigma that millions of Americans face every day. And as part of that, Shatterproof co-developed the Shatterproof Addiction Stigma Index with researchers at Indiana University to better understand the public's knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs regarding substance use disorder, referred to frequently as addiction. Some of the problems with addiction stigma is that it clouds the nation's ability to coalesce around meaningful solutions, and that includes treatment, harm reduction, and recovery supports and services. With this launch, Shatterproof aims to change hearts and minds to save lives, especially as nearly 49 people identify as living with a substance use disorder in the United States alone. So first, I want to introduce Courtney McKeon, Senior Vice President of the National Stigma Initiative. Courtney, thank you for sharing about the SASI.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glasner, for moderating this session.
My pleasure. Very happy to be here. Can you tell us what is the purpose of the SASI?
Yeah, the Shatterproof Addiction Stigma Index, or also known as the SASI, is the largest and most expansive measurement tool designed to date to assess the general public's attitudes about substance use and people who have substance use disorder, or SUD. The data really helps raise awareness of addiction stigma. So over time, the goal is that it will allow us to track progress and hold our nation accountable for ending addiction stigma collectively. In addition, the Shatterproof Addiction Stigma Index can be adapted to evaluate the efficacy of interventions at reducing stigma and help inform continuous improvement efforts.
That is so important because a lot of us with NIH funding are actively doing research on stigma and how to shape and form interventions that will reduce stigma, but having a validated stigma measurement tool such as the SASI is going to really help us to understand the extent to which we're able to impact this very important dimension and experience for people with substance use disorders. Can you tell me a little bit about how the SASI was fielded?
The SASI was administered in the spring of 2024. It was fielded in both English and Spanish by Ipsos Public Affairs, which is a global marketing firm that fields the Shatterproof Addiction Stigma Index on behalf of Shatterproof. Ipsos utilizes a knowledge panel for recruitment. So this is the largest online panel that's relying on a probability-based sampling technique. The SASI reached over 8,000 Americans, and giving its sampling technique, it allows us to take the results and generalize them to Americans broadly. So for example, on the SASI, we asked if respondents know somebody with a substance use disorder. 54% of respondents answered yes, they knew someone with a substance use disorder. Thus, we can say that 54% of Americans know someone with a substance use disorder.
That is so helpful and also sort of speaks to just how common of an experience this is. How would you describe or define what addiction stigma is?
Yeah, addiction stigma is a set of negative attitudes and beliefs. They often leads to unjust treatment of people with addiction. Stigma is a critical barrier to help-seeking behavior and encourages social isolation, which ultimately contributes to the more than 107,000 lives we've lost to this crisis in 2023. Stigma can be really hard to identify, but the SASI helps us see how pervasive in nature it is. So the SASI truly aims to measure 4 different types of stigma: public stigma, structural stigma, self-stigma, and stigma against medications for opioid use disorder, also known as MOUD. The 2024 narrative report that we're releasing today primarily focuses on public stigma, so society's negative attitudes towards a group of people, which creates environments where individuals feel unwelcome, judged, and/or blamed. The public stigma scale can be further disaggregated into 3 subscales. So we look at home life, social distance, workplace, social distance, and traditional prejudice. Home life social distance would be, would you want someone with a substance use disorder to be your close friend or neighbor? Workplace is looking at whether you would hire someone with substance use disorder or if you'd have them as a coworker. And then traditional prejudice is really looking at whether someone with substance use disorder is competent or trustworthy.
That's so interesting because I think a lot of the time it's hard for people to see the connection between some of these experiences and one's likelihood of accessing treatment. But I think you really kind of hit the nail on the head as far as the feeling of isolation when people don't want to be your friend or don't want to associate with you in the workplace or socially. It makes it really hard to come out of that shell and overcome some of the shame that can act as a barrier to doing constructive things about it, because it's hard to find somebody to really talk to and confide in about it out of fear for how those people are going to react. So you're capturing something really important with all the scales that have been given such thoughtful consideration in the subscales, because they really hit on some dimensions of sort of psychological experience that can be so isolating. Could you talk a little bit about who the SASI partners are?
Yeah, so the SASI was first released in 2021. It was designed in partnership with Doctors Bria Perry and Ann Crandell at Indiana University. The 2024 data was cleaned and analyzed with support by Doctors Bria Perry and Megan Bolton from the Ursay Institute at Indiana University. Their partnership has truly been critical to the work that Shatterproof has been doing around addiction stigma, and also their work in stigma reduction more broadly has been a huge benefit to many fields.
Excellent. Okay. And how would you describe, I mean, I think you've already described it in some of your earlier responses, but maybe you could say a little bit more about why the SASI is important.
We are at a critical time in our society. We really need to understand and address this urgent public health crisis. I'm sure you've seen many news headlines recently that says that the numbers of, lives lost to this epidemic have started to decrease. But the real headline is that those numbers are truly still alarming. And this is still an issue that we need to raise awareness about. And not only that, truly understand what the role that stigma plays. So the SASI really looks to understand what stigma exists so that we can address this critical driver of addiction more precisely with evidence-based and evidence-informed interventions. Societies take a long time to change. We see this with other social change movements, such as HIV/AIDS, same-sex marriage. It's going to take a sustained and committed effort across this country at both the grassroots and the grass tops. So eventually, again, the SASI will serve as that mechanism for us to track progress, to see if we're effectively doing what we say we're doing.
That makes a lot of sense. It's one thing to sort of talk about stigma and describe the way we understand it, but to objectively measure it using, again, a validated questionnaire or measurement tool is super important for understanding whether and how we're moving the needle on stigma and what, objectively speaking, the impact of that is on people accessing care and on overcoming some of the very significant barriers that we've experienced to overcome the overdose crisis and just in general, the sort of prevalence of addiction in our society. So can we talk a little bit about how often Shatterproof will conduct the SASI?
Yeah, Dr. Glasner, if it'd be okay, would first like to dive into some of the key findings that we had. I put together a little slide deck.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Perfect. So we'll go ahead and we will jump in. So first, I would like to just ground us a little bit in the SASI methodology. I know we talked about a little bit in some of the questions that you have prepared for me, but it's important to really understand, one, that the Shatterproof Addiction Stigma Index looks at indices. An index measures change in a representative group of individual data points. So there's no one question on the SASI that can encompass the complexity of stigma, how stigma manifests, what stigma looks like. So by using these indices, we get a broader and a more holistic view of what that stigma looks like. Again, as I mentioned earlier, these indices are really broken up into public stigma, structural stigma, self-stigma, and medication for opioid use disorder stigma. The second piece of the SASI methodology that I would like to underscore is our vignette strategy. It is really important when we have people go in to take this survey that they're all starting at like a level playing field, right? We all have lots of lived experience that shapes our perceptions and beliefs about something. So instead of presenting this and saying, John has a substance use disorder, we describe a person in a short paragraph named John, and we go through some of the criteria that would identify John as having a substance use disorder without ever saying the word substance use disorder. That removes the bias that one might come in as they think about addiction in their own personal lives. So the Shatterproof Addiction Stigma Index uses that vignette strategy, but we also have 12 vignettes. So we call it a 6x2 vignette design. Those vignettes are looking at John having problematic relationships with different types of substances. So you'll see that on the right here: alcohol, prescription opioids, heroin. We also look at active use versus recovery. So the amount of data available to us, this data set is so robust and rich, it could take a long time to get through all of it, but it is a valuable resource as we try to better understand addiction stigma, how addiction varies across substances, how stigma still persists when someone is in recovery. And then in 2024, we were able to also add a vignette around marijuana use disorder to see what that looked like. So the key findings, I mentioned earlier, most Americans, 54%, know someone with a substance use disorder. This issue is broad. A lot of people are impacted by substance use disorder, whether we're talking about it or not. You know, nearly 49 million people in the United States, 12 and older, have a substance use disorder. So this is truly something that impacts us all and does not discriminate. Most people misunderstand the nature of SUD. We see that Americans distance themselves from people with SUD. That goes earlier to the conversation around social isolation. Furthermore, people hold stigma towards certain treatment pathways, and we're still seeing mixed support around life-saving harm reduction strategies, despite some recent research. So let's go ahead and dive into some of those. So we see here that 3/4 or 74% of Americans do not believe that a person with a substance use disorder is experiencing a chronic medical illness like diabetes, arthritis, or heart disease. We also see that 55% don't believe that a person with SUD could be experiencing a mental illness, and 53% of people do not believe that a person is experiencing a physical illness. So this basic misunderstanding of substance use disorder can lead people to overemphasize personal responsibility of substance use disorder. So, for example, 50% of Americans truly felt that it was John's lack of moral strength that had caused his substance use disorder. So education is going to be a critical component of the equation as we strive to address addiction stigma in this country. The second piece is distancing from people with SUD. So we see that about 4 in 10 adults are unwilling to spend an evening socializing with someone with substance use disorder and or having someone with a substance use disorder as a friend. We also see in the workplace that while 77% of people are willing to have John as a coworker, someone with an SUD, that number goes to 52% as we start to talk about John working closely with that person. So this is an example of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard. We see this a lot. And this is put more simply is when people are more comfortable with something in theory, but not when it's happening close to them, right? So we see that in a variety of spaces as we're looking at addiction stigma, including around stigma towards treatment pathways. So if you look at the bottom of the screen here, we see that only half would be willing to have a clinic that offered MOUD in their neighborhood. But the other stats that we have around medication for opioid use disorder really underscore that 82% of Americans believe that MOUD helps someone cope with their opioid use disorder. We also see that 78% understand that it is an effective treatment for opioid use disorder. Yet we see this low support once we ask people if they're willing to have a clinic in their backyard. And then above, we also see that 4 in 10 Americans, they believe that medication for opioid use disorder is substituting one drug addiction for another. This really clouds people's ability to try medications as part of their treatment pathway. So we really need to be open to supporting a more inclusive definition of recovery. So it's truly any positive change to improve someone's relationship with substances. I think if we do that, people will be more open to experiencing the positive effects of medication for opioid use disorder, but also we will see more support around harm reduction interventions. So promisingly here, we see 77 in 10, 71% adults are supporting personally procuring naloxone, or also known as Narcan, a medication that rapidly reverses opioid overdoses. But then we see a little less progress on this bottom bullet. Less than half of Americans would be willing to have a safe injection site, or also known as a safe consumption site, in their communities, despite research that shows that safe injection sites are reducing overdose deaths, they are decreasing rates of infectious disease, and they are also decreasing substance use in public areas. So as we see an increase of awareness of and access to harm reduction strategies, we are hopeful to continue to see progress made on these SASI measures, as these ones can truly be linked directly to saving lives. I can stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Courtney. That is so interesting and so informative. I think one of the takeaways for me is that factually speaking, we've made a lot of headway in sort of educating the public around harm reduction, medications for opioid use disorder, the treatable nature of SUD or substance use disorders, and what is more commonly referred to by many as addiction or a severe form of a substance use disorder. But then that phenomenon that you kind of described, we're not in my backyard, so being close to it feels a little bit maybe scary for some people, is like they don't really know what to expect if they're in close proximity to someone who has this difficulty or who's seeking treatment for it. And I think that's one of the reasons why the story, the platform for sharing stories is something that really brings a lot of value to this process. And one of the things that I really love and appreciate about Shatterproof as an organization, sort of providing that platform, not only for people to share their stories because it's therapeutic for a person to share their own story, but when people sort of hear from a real person about how they recovered and how medication transformed their lives, I think it's a lot easier to internalize that and make it meaningful than when people are learning facts and statistics that maybe intellectually make sense to them. So for that reason, I'm really excited for later in this presentation when we have the opportunity to hear from Kaitlyn. But before we get to Kaitlyn's story, I do have a few follow-up questions for you about the SASI. The first is, how often will Shatterproof conduct the SASI?
The SASI will be fielded periodically. So there was nearly 3 years between the first and the second fielding, so 2021 and 2024 respectively. We have the third SASI already planned for 2026. The 2024 SASI really focused on raising awareness. As we know, again, societies take a long time to change, and the SASI is truly looking at population level shifts. So we are hopeful that in 2026, we can start to track more progress towards that population level stigma reduction.
Well, and that longitudinal nature of administering a validated measurement like the Shatterproof Addiction Index is exactly what we need to do to understand the impact it's having over time. So I really appreciate the methodology there. Another question I have is that the Shatterproof Addiction Index in Stigma Index in 2024 looks very different from the index first fielded in 2021. Can you provide a little more background on that?
Yes, I can. So the 2021 SASI did a really great job at setting a baseline for addiction stigma in our country, as we talked about throughout this conversation. So when that index was presented, it wasn't a traditional data type report. It is, when you think about an index, that is how it was presented. So kind of further to the comments you just made a little bit ago, as Shatterproof really strives to lean into what our strengths are in the field, as it's going to take a multi-pronged collective action to effectively shift this narrative, we decided to lean into our expertise. So we thought it'd be more compelling if we centered the narrative around one person's story. And that's why Kaitlyn is, with us today. We really wanted to use her personal experience and her journey with substance use, the impact that it had on her, her family, her community, as a way to humanize substance use disorder and bridge some of that connection and that disconnect that scares people away from talking about it, from being close to someone, things of that nature. So while the 2024 report is in narrative form, we have uploaded additional analyses for 2024 for people to view on our website. We will continue to look at that data in different ways between now and the next SASI in 2026. And in addition, I know people who love data will be excited about this. We are now able to share the full 2021 data set. So people will be able to request that online. There is a form where they can make that request, and they can run their own analysis to really inform the work that they're doing in the field.
That's very exciting. It's going to be a great way of disseminating more information on this really important topic. I'm sure that that's going to get a lot of action and traction once it's available to us researchers. So that's great to hear. So I'm sure a lot of people on this call are wondering how they can get involved with the work that you're doing. What are some of the ways to be part of the movement to end addiction stigma?
Yeah, the thing I'd underscore here is, again, it is going to take a collective action. And so as we think about the calls to action and the power we hold, is how we talked about it in the report, it's on the individual level. So what can I do as a person, who is a part of the general public today? And it sounds so obvious and cliche in ways, but treat people with empathy and compassion. So we actually, the way that we try to come to these calls to action, we said, we have this robust data set of qualitative data. We are doing interviews. People are trusting us with their stories day in and day out. How can we listen to them instead of the field making decisions on how we can improve the lives and the quality of lives of people who've been impacted by substance use disorder? Let's ask the people, let's center the voice of the people who need to be making these decisions and helping us move forward. So we looked at all of that analysis, and this is where we came up with some of these action items. So again, like, treat people with empathy and compassion. We heard that over and over again. Could be the most powerful way that you can be there for someone who's impacted by substance use disorder. Educate yourself and others. So seek out information, reputable sources about substance use disorder. Know how to identify and respond to an overdose. Learn about resources available. Where are you carrying naloxone in your purse, right? So one of the things that we also wanted to do in this report is really call out the other organizations that are doing this work. So we highlighted shatterproof.org, but we also highlighted SAMHSA, the National Harm Reduction Coalition, Center for Motivation and Change. Those are some organizations who have great resources and digestible resources for people who are learning to educate themselves and hopefully start to be that trusted messenger in their own circles about substance use disorder and some of the misconceptions that are going around. And then the last thing, like you said, share your story. Stories truly connect us all, and it's a way to help humanize the condition and to talk about it. And it doesn't have to be on a platform such as a webinar. It doesn't have to be in a national report. It can truly be sharing your story with one person that you trust, and you have no idea if that could be a catalyst to something else in their lives. So really just empowering people to don't hide it, that this is not shameful. This is a medical condition, and we want people to feel supported as they look to find what next steps on their path that there might be. So those are the three little tidbits that we would give to anyone listening on the webinar today.
Little bit big. It's, because I think each one of them has the potential to make tremendous impact. I really appreciate the way that you describe the importance of sharing one's story. I feel like I come across that a lot, where something I've said or something someone said to me or just as like a practicing clinician in psychology, people share with me that whether it's about addiction or about mental health or something else very personal, that some of the things that impact them the most in steps and actions they've taken in their life that have been different is something that they learned from someone else's story that helped them to not feel alone with whatever struggle they were working their way through. So really appreciate that messaging. And as you noted, the 2024 SASI explores those results through the lens of Kaitlyn's story. Kaitlyn is part of the UNSHAME KY initiative and is a peer recovery coach. Please join me in welcoming Kaitlyn. Kaitlyn, I think you had some remarks that you wanted to share to open up.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. The the words that I have to express my gratitude, there's just not enough for it. It's a privilege and an honor to be on here. I think, when I heard Courtney say that the SASI report had reached, I think, over 8,000 Americans, when I share my story, I always say, like, if I could just help one person, one person is just enough because we have lost so many lives to substance use disorder. So to be able to reach that many people is a blessing in itself. But as you all said, my name is Kaitlyn. I am a person in long-term recovery. I work as a recovery coach at Voices of Hope in Lexington, Kentucky. And what we do is we provide peer support and resources to people who are in recovery or currently in active use or experiencing homelessness. We basically meet people where they're at. And we also provide harm reduction resources in our office, as far as Narcan, fentanyl test strips, pregnancy test, all the good stuff there. So, yeah.
Thank you for telling us a little bit more about Unshame Kentucky. It's a very important initiative. And I think you're sort of putting into action sort of all of those 3 points that that Courtney was describing as far as the way that you treat people, educating yourself and other people, and sharing your story in your work there. So thank you so much for those thoughts. Maybe if you could tell us a little bit about your journey through substance use and the way in which or ways in which stigma has impacted you, your family, and community.
Sure.
That's a start.
So, let's see. I was in active use for about 10 years. I started using opiates when I was around 17 years old. I just kind of, got involved in the wrong crowd. And for what started out as fun to me, led to a very detrimental and extensive battle and fight for my life. And so back then, when I was using, in between my substance use, I started to have children. And in the beginning, I was able to get a hold of it because it wasn't as serious. And so as it started to progress, I could not stop using. And so back then, we did not have access to the resources that there is today. And within the process of me losing my children, I think people kind of looked at me, in my experience, people looked at me as this monster and this mother who was choosing substances over her children. I mean, I had tried numerous detox facilities, treatment centers for so long. I was in and out of being incarcerated. But one of the many things that I tried was being put on methadone, which is one of the medications for opioid use disorder. And the backlash that I received for that, it was very shaming for me. And, Courtney had mentioned one of the stigmas that we experience is self-stigma. And while I was going to the methadone clinic, I was able to secure employment working at a gas station. But anybody that knows anything about methadone, you have to be there between 5 a.m. and like 11 a.m. before they close. And that is when the time frame you have to go dose. And so for me to have to go to my manager and say, hey, I'm in the methadone clinic, this is what I have to go do. The way that their attitudes shifted towards me in the workplace was kind of like, oh, so I got moved off working off the cash register to just stocking and doing inventory. They kind of just put me in the back. And I knew that the moment that I had told them that I was in the clinic, that was the reason why that I was not allowed to work up front anymore. With my parents, it got to where people didn't want me over around family holidays anymore. People didn't trust having me in the home anymore. Just an automatic, oh, she is an active use, she's going to steal from us. It was just an automatic thought that went with somebody who had a substance use disorder.
Yeah, you really sounds like you could experience so much of what we've been discussing today in the form of the SASI and the data, really firsthand. And it sounds like that had a pretty profound impact on you.
Yeah.
And yet you still went to treatment and did what you needed to do, and made that commitment, which is even harder to do in the face of all that you were experiencing. So hats off to you. So
Thank you.
testament to why you are where you are today. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about how allyship and support played a role in your journey, because with all that you just described, um, support would be the likely kind of antidote that would keep you going on the path that you were on, despite how difficult it was.
Yeah. So support played a major role to get me where I'm at today. Of course, growing up, my family, we were always very close. I was very close with my siblings, but once my substance use started to progress, a lot of my family, I think they just didn't know what to do. And so the anger, the shame, the sadness that they felt, the easiest thing for them to do was just to step away. But my mother was my biggest cheerleader. She was my biggest fan, and it didn't matter. It didn't matter what I did. Like, she continued to get back up with me. It was like if I fell down, she fell down. And if it wasn't for her, I would not be here today. She truly saved my life. I can't imagine what it would be like for a mother to have to, call the police on her daughter and turn her daughter in, knowing that she has to go sit in a jail and physically detox. But she knew at that point in time it was the only thing that was going to save my life. And at the time, I couldn't see it, but today I know that she did it out of love for me. And even then, being incarcerated for many, many months, after a certain amount of time, she would send me letters and let me know, I don't love your substance use, but I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever I have to do to learn about it and support you because you're my daughter. Um, my sister Leah, she would message me all throughout the night and, just let me know that she was there. She couldn't understand what I was going through, but she was there. But like once I finally got into treatment this past time, being able to form a support group, being able to get my sponsor. I have an incredible sponsor. I mean, she's out of this world. And then my wife, I met my wife in recovery. And, once we get into recovery, it's still not easy, but me being able to become a mom again and go through all of that, like the support of her has been amazing. So you can't do it alone. You have to have that love and support and have people there to build you up and let you know, I believe in you.
It is hard to love someone with a substance use disorder at times because the things that they do, and you know this from your own experience, are really kind of a different version of themselves. And I kind of like really resonate with what your mom said.
Mm.
So wise for her to separate your substance use from you, Kaitlyn, as a person. And I think that's a lot of what other people who are afraid to be around someone with a substance use disorder or afraid of what they might do might benefit from hearing and learning, is that there's a version of oneself in recovery that is wildly different from the person who has been taken hold of by substance use. And you can still love and support a person who even is in the throes of active substance use, because doing that will help them get to the other side of it where you have landed. But it's very hard.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you sharing that with us. So there's the social support or the family support of loved ones that is really, really crucial. But then there's also the way that you take care of yourself. So maybe I'll shift gears and ask a little bit about how self-care fits into your recovery.
So anybody that has been through recovery will know that self-care is so important. And even if you're not in recovery, self-care is important. If we don't take care of ourselves, we are going to get tired and exhausted and run down. And I should probably practice self-care more than I do. Um, but throughout my recovery journey, I have gained the most magnificent and strong spiritual bond in my spiritual life that I have ever had before. So whether it is being able to do prayer and meditation, or I'm one of those people that jam my praise and worship on the way to work in the mornings and just have that me time in the car. Um, for me, going and getting my nails done is self-care for me, if I can afford it for that for that month, and balance the finances in for that, going to meetings, but also, when I'm at work and I get to step in and chair those meetings at work. Some people say, like, you got to keep your recovery separate from work, and I understand that, but being able to chair those meetings at work and listen to what other people have to say about what they're going through, and I see that other people are struggling worse than I am, like, that's self-care for me, because coming out of that room, like, my cup gets filled. And then just being able to take advantage of spending time with my family, because I took that for granted for so many years.
I think that's really it's really meaningful to hear all the different definitions for you of self-care. And I think it also highlights the fact that it is a very individual kind of idea. Is like, what is self-care for one person may not be for another, but it's those things that really build you up and build up your inner strength. So if those things are spending time with your family, or if they're taking a break from your family, spending some time on your own, or if it's going to meetings, or whatever it is, I think we all could do more self-care. So when you said that in the beginning, I thought, well, you and a whole lot of other people could always do more. But I think most importantly, you're very mindful of what those things are and the role that they play in your recovery and how important they are. And that's going to keep you sort of driving yourself to do more as much as you can. you're a person with a busy life and a family, and sometimes it's really hard, but it's good that you're keeping that in perspective as far as its importance. Um, so I have one more question for you, which I think is really important for our audience, which is, where did you go to find help, or what advice would you give someone who is impacted right now?
So like I had said before, in the beginning of my substance use, the lack of resources was really the main trouble I had when it came to finding recovery. But I spent 10 years in active use, so the farther along I got, the more available resources came. And so, by the time that I had access to long-term treatment this last time, I was lucky to, I don't want to say I was lucky to catch, charges to, you know, develop a record and background, but I was lucky to go in front of a judge that had dealt with substance use disorder personally within her own family. And so for me to be able to look at her and personally say, I have a problem and I need help, she was able to send me to treatment. But for me to look at somebody else today, I have to say this out loud. Like, I know that there is so much stigma still going on that we're trying to fight. And I'm sorry for anybody that is feeling that or suffering in silence, but for the ones that you feel judged by, you have to remember that they are not the ones fighting this battle for you. You are the one fighting the battle. And there are so many places that are open today and willing to accept you with open arms. And whatever pathway is going to work for you, we are willing to be here and support you. Whatever is going to work for you and help you stay alive, that's what we want, because those of us in recovery and that struggle with substance use, like, we all have the same end goal, and that is to find freedom and happiness and to live a successful, sustainable life. So you just have to remember that you're the one that is on this journey.
Very important words of wisdom from you, Kaitlyn. I so appreciate your time today and for you bravely sharing your story. Um, we are going to open it up to questions from the audiences. In addition to Courtney and Kaitlyn, we're also joined by Ashley Siebel, data specialist, who is a member of the Shatterproof National Stigma Initiative. I am going to start with the first question that is coming from the audience. Are you able to break down the SASI data by state? And I think this one goes to Ashley.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Glasner. So certain states can be analyzed independently due to the larger sample sizes. However, the design weighting and iterative proportional fitting, which is rate weighting, was benchmarked to the entire US population using the US Census Bureau PS, so the current population survey. You can look at responses by state, but it's important to remember that those responses can only be attributed to the responses and not generalized to the state as a whole.
Ashley, I would also just plug there that as part of the 2024 additional analysis downloadable on the website, Ashley and team have done some analysis by region.
Super helpful. Thank you both. I have another question from the audience on explain for syringe service programs on this webinar how and why you believe this effort will support their harm reduction efforts. Courtney, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So we really truly believe that any organization along the spectrum from prevention to treatment to harm reduction can really benefit from the SASI data. As I mentioned earlier, the SASI data gives us this clear understanding into where the general public stands, and that helps sets a foundation for evidence-based and evidence-informed interventions, but it can also help organizations even just communicate to their audiences what they need to hear. So I would say, it can inform outreach efforts. It can inform those educational messages. So where for a community that you serve, we can look to see potentially, where are the biggest misunderstandings around S2D? Do they support procuring naloxone? What do they think about safe injection sites in their community? And then we can really wrap outreach efforts in any of our initiatives around where we see the highest levels of stigma. So again, I would also just like to underscore that while Shatterproof coordinates the Shatterproof Addiction Stigma Index with the data and the report, we really did our best to lean into the experiences and insights from local communities and people with lived experience, such as Kaitlyn, and we really did our best to center those voices. So we really hope that people can also reach out and let us know how they'd like to see the Shatterproof Addiction Stigma Index data sorted, and we can take that into consideration as we invest our own resources into that data analysis to move the field forward.
Thank you so much, Courtney. I have one for Kaitlyn, which is, what does it look like for you to show up in your workplace or in your community in a way that is judgment-free?
Gosh, it is amazing. So I work with 90% of the people in my workplace today have experienced substance use either themselves or within their family today. But I am trusted. I'm one of the people that get to show up first thing by myself to the office and have a pin to the office to unlock it. And I'm trusted to be able to close the office down and put the pin in and lock the office up. And so to be able to have that trust in me and somebody to look at me and say, I know that you're capable of this. I know that you can handle this. I know we don't have to worry about her doing this, doing that, anything going missing or her messing something up. And not just that, but I am a reliable employee today. Like they can put me on the schedule and they know that I'm going to show up at work and I am going to be somebody that shows compassion and care to the participants that we have come in today, and they don't have to worry about whether I'm going to come in for 2 weeks and then fall off the face of the earth. So my work ethic is something I take very serious today, and they can see that in me.
That's wonderful, especially in light of some of the survey findings around trust and the kind of the idea that people have a hard time trusting someone with a substance use disorder. And we kind of understand how during the course of a person's struggle with actively using substances, that trust erosion is a realistic thing. But seeing someone like you come out on the other side of that after rebuilding those connections with people in your personal life and your professional life, and to become a very trusted person, I think gives us all very realistic hope that that's not a permanent state for people who have or have had a substance use disorder. I have another question for you, which is, why did you decide to share your story originally, and why did you decide to be involved in this project?
Decided to do this because the amount of people that I have lost over time, they didn't get a chance to share what they needed to say. And so, especially one of my best friends that I lost in treatment, I made a commitment right then and there when I lost her. Her name was Erin, that I would start to recover out loud and be a voice for those who didn't have one, and also be a voice for those who are still suffering in silence. And so when, Courtney had originally reached out to me for UNSHAME, I was, in awe, because I just never imagined that the pain and the guilt and the humiliation that I had went through in the past could come out for the greater good. And so I'm an open book today, and anything that I can do or say, regardless of how bad my past was, if it can help somebody understand substance use disorder today, or help somebody who is suffering be able to come forward, I am willing to do that.
I'm hopeful that many others will be inspired to do the same, leading by your example. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Um, I will turn this one to Courtney. I am curious about the different interpretations with medications for opioid use disorders. How do we help break through the stigma?
Yeah, so Dr. Glasner, I think I will refer back to kind of, the complexities of what we see on the data. People, understand that medication for opioid disorders helps people cope. They understand that is effective, but yet we still see, I would say, higher numbers than we would like around people also endorsing this harmful belief that medications are just substituting one addiction for another. So what we have found in some of the community-based campaigns that we do across the country is when we really put a lot of resources and effort behind that educational piece, that we start to see people start to, that endorsement go down. So we have seen that successfully work in a number of our campaigns. And the thing that our team always debriefs is like education, education, education. The more that we can help people just truly understand the effectiveness of medication, and that everyone has a different pathway to recovery. And even, as Kaitlyn mentioned earlier, let's even think more broadly about what recovery means for people. It's not always abstinence-based recovery. And if we want to keep people alive, I think that is truly an important thing for all of us to lock arms and come shoulder to shoulder together about.
Thank you. I could not agree with you more. And I have so much more that I could say about that, but we are just about at time. So I want to note that there are more questions, which is great. I know you're all a wonderful, engaged audience. That there's more questions than we have time to answer right now, but we will address any follow-up questions by email to attendees afterwards, so you won't leave with your questions unanswered. We just can't answer them all this moment. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank Kaitlyn for your courage and sharing your story. To download the SASI and learn more about the research and methodology, you can visit the Shatterproof website at shatterproof.org/SASI in all caps. To learn more about Shatterproof and ways to support and or become involved in their mission, you can visit www.shatterproof.org. A recording of today's briefing will be emailed along with a social toolkit, downloadable graphics, and follow-up resources. And finally, we call on all of you to take action by collectively creating a more understanding, compassionate, and supportive society for people with substance use disorders. We know that you wouldn't be here otherwise if you weren't part of that mission. So really appreciate your presence and attention for this hour. And we also invite you to share the index to your stakeholders on your newsletters, social channels, and finally recognize that substance use disorder is a chronic medical condition. So with that, we will say goodbye for now.